Hands in the air. Keep walking towards me. Walk towards me now. Keep your hands up. Right here. Stop. Stop.
Get on your knees.
Get on your knees. Hands on top of your head.
Get on your belly. Put your hands behind your back.
Slow down.
His name was Steven Sanchez. He was 34 years old. And on the morning of April 29th, 2024, he was found dead inside a storage shed in a backyard, shot once in the head. Steven did not die in a war zone. He did not die in a dark alleyway on the wrong side of a city. He died in a place where people live, where neighbors know each other's names, where a pregnant woman was close enough to hear it happen and close enough to call for help while still shaking. The man who pulled the trigger would spend the next 3 days running. He drove at speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour through residential neighborhoods. He truly believed that the people around him were not human, that they were shapeshifters, that something had given him permission to act. His name was Joseph Rhea. Everyone called him Izzy. And what happened on that April night is not just a story about a shooting. It is a story about the space between what a person believes is real and what the rest of the world calls reality. It is a story about a man who was lost long before he ever picked up a gun. But most of all, it is a story about Steven Sanchez, a man who deserved to come home and never did. Every terrible night has a moment before it becomes terrible. The hours before April 29th were quiet. The neighborhood settled into the rhythms of a late spring evening. Porch lights flickered, cars parked. The kind of night that feels ordinary because ordinary nights are all most of us ever know. Steven Sanchez was 34. He was the kind of man who showed up. That is one of the quiet things people say about someone after they are gone, that he showed up. For the people in his life, for the moments that needed him there. He had a history like all of us do. He had a face and a laugh and things he liked to talk about. He had a future that had not yet been written. That night, he was at a property where people he knew were staying. A woman was there. She was pregnant. She knew both Steven and Isaiah. She occupied that difficult middle position that witnesses so often find themselves in, someone who knew everyone, trusted everyone to some degree, and had no reason to expect what was about to happen. Joseph Rhea was also there. Isaiah was known in the circle. He was present in people's lives, sometimes welcome, sometimes complicated, sometimes difficult to read. But he was there. He was part of the social fabric of this particular group of people. What those closest to him had noticed in the weeks and months leading up to that night was harder to put into words. Something had shifted. Isaiah had begun saying things that did not track. He spoke about people not being who they appeared to be. He talked about shapeshifters, beings that looked human but were not. He had a paranoid certainty about the world around him that unsettled the people who cared about him. Whether anyone tried to intervene, we do not know. What we know is that on the night of April 28th into the early morning hours of April 29th, Joseph Rhea was on that property. And Steven Sanchez was there too. For a brief window of time, they were in the same space. And then everything changed. There is always a moment. In every case like this, investigators and psychologists and journalists spend a great deal of time looking for it. The moment when a choice was made. The moment when the path split and someone went the wrong way. The moment that, if different, could have meant a different ending. For Rhea, that moment may have come long before the night of the shooting. It may have come in the days when his thinking began to fracture and no one stopped it, or no one could. It may have come in a choice to carry a firearm, to bring a loaded weapon into an emotional and unstable situation, to walk through a door with a gun in his hand. Because that is what the pregnant woman told police. She told investigators that Isaiah came into the house that night with a gun already in his hand. He was not calm. He was not simply carrying a firearm the way a person might carry keys. He came in with intention, with urgency, with something burning behind his eyes. She said he told her, "I thought you wanted me to do that." That sentence, it is worth sitting with for a moment. I thought you wanted me to do that. It suggests that Isaiah was not acting on impulse alone. In his mind, there was a framework, a logic, a set of signals he believed he had received from her or from the world or from something inside his head that had been telling him things for weeks or months. He was acting on instructions that no one had actually given him. He believed he had permission. He believed the right thing had been done. Steven Sanchez was in the shed at the back of the property, and Isaiah walked toward it. The next few minutes would change everything for a family, for a community, and for Isaiah himself. It was fast. That is one of the most devastating truths about violence. It does not take long to end a life. The buildup, the days, the deteriorating mental state, the loaded weapon, the walk across a yard, all of that takes time. The act itself takes almost none. Stephen Sanchez was in the shed. Joseph Rhea entered with the gun. A single shot was fired. Stephen was struck in the head. He died there inside the shed in the dark in a backyard on a spring night when the rest of the neighborhood was asleep. He was 34 years old. Isaiah did not call for help. He did not check on Stephen. He did not dial 911. He did not sit down and wait for the weight of what had happened to catch up with him. He left. The pregnant woman, the one who had watched him walk in with the gun, the one who had heard him say those words. She was the one who called 911. She made the call while still at the scene. She told the dispatcher what had happened. She told them where to go. She was pregnant, and she had just witnessed something no one should ever witness. And she picked up her phone, and she told the truth. And somewhere out in the city, Isaiah Joseph Rhea was already moving away from what he had done. But the night was not finished with him yet. Within minutes of the 911 call, officers were on their way. The address was flagged. The details were relayed. A man is shot in the backyard, a shed, a gun, a suspect already gone. When officers arrived at the property in the early morning hours, approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, they moved quickly and carefully through the scene, the backyard, the shed, and there inside they found Stephen Sanchez. He was already dead. The medical examiner would later confirm a single gunshot wound to the head. Officers secured the scene. Detectives were called. The evidence collection process began. And the name Isaiah Joseph Rhea was entered into the system as the primary suspect in the killing of Stephen Sanchez. Isaiah, meanwhile, had disappeared. He was gone from the neighborhood, gone from the people who knew him. He moved through the city as someone who understood on some level that what had happened could not be undone, and who had decided that running was the answer. For 3 days, he was nowhere. No arrest, no confrontation, no surrender. 3 days in which detectives worked to build the case. 3 days in which the pregnant witness gave her statement again and again to investigators who needed to understand every detail of what she had seen. 3 days in which surveillance cameras in the area were reviewed, in which cell phone records were examined, in which the network of people Isaiah knew was carefully and methodically mapped. The public was not loudly alarmed. This was not a manhunt splashed across every news channel. It was quieter than that, steady, methodical. But on the 3rd day, someone spotted a brown SUV, and the chase was about to begin. Before we get to the chase, we need to go inside. Not inside a car, or inside a courtroom, or inside a shed in a backyard. Inside the room where truth is supposed to be found. The interrogation room is a strange place. It is deliberately ordinary. The walls are usually bare. The table is usually bolted down. There are chairs. There is a camera mounted somewhere, always recording every word and every second of silence. The lights are often flat and fluorescent, the kind that do not flatter anyone. The idea is that there is nowhere to hide. Detectives who specialize in homicide interrogations spend years learning how to read people in rooms like this. They learn the difference between someone who is lying and someone who is telling a fragmented truth. They learn what silence means. They learn what eye contact means and what the absence of it means. They learn to notice when a person's body says something different from their mouth. Isaiah Rhea eventually came into a room like that. He sat across from investigators who had spent 3 days building a picture of what had happened in that backyard on April 29th. They had the witness account of the pregnant woman. They had the physical evidence from the shed. They had the trajectory of the bullet. They had whatever the cameras in the neighborhood had captured. And they had Isaiah, a man who by all accounts was still processing the world through a distorted lens. The detectives had to navigate something unusual. This was not a straightforward confrontation with a calculating criminal. Isaiah's worldview had fractured in ways that made conventional interrogation strategies complicated. He was not a man who had sat down and planned a murder with cold precision. He was a man who believed with complete sincerity that the people around him were not entirely human, that they could change shape, that something in the world had given him a purpose or a signal. Interrogating someone in that state requires patience. It requires the ability to follow someone's internal logic, even when that logic is not grounded in consensus reality. The detectives followed that logic. They let Isaiah talk. And what came out of his mouth over the course of that interview would tell its own story, not just about one night in April, but about a mind that had been coming apart for a long time before the gun was ever raised. Isaiah did not confess to the shooting. He denied it. Sitting in that interrogation room with the evidence mounting against him and the charges already being drafted, Isaiah Joseph Rhea maintained that he had not fired the shot that killed Steven Sanchez. He was firm about that. But what he said around that denial was in some ways more revealing than a confession would have been. Isaiah talked about the world he was living in, a world that most people could not see, a world where certain individuals were not what they appeared, where they could shift change, become something else. He had been watching people. He had been tracking things that others dismissed. He believed he understood something that others did not. When investigators asked about his relationship with the people at the property, he was vague and circular. He talked around things. He made references that seemed to make sense within his internal framework, but that investigators could not immediately decode. He acknowledged being at the location. He could not or would not explain what had happened. He could not or would not explain why he had a gun. He could not or would not explain what he had said to the pregnant woman. Those words, "I thought you wanted me to do that." When pressed on specific details, his responses became less consistent. Investigators noted inconsistencies, not the kind that come from a sophisticated liar carefully managing a cover story, but the kind that come from a person whose grip on sequence and fact has become unreliable. This is one of the most difficult aspects of cases involving significant mental health deterioration. It becomes hard to locate the line between what a person knows and is hiding and what a person genuinely cannot reconstruct, because their perception of events is so distorted that memory itself has become unstable. What the interrogation room captured was a man who was on some level both present and absent at the same time. Present in his body, sitting there, answering questions. Absent from the shared reality of what had actually happened. The investigation would not rest on his words alone. The physical evidence would carry the weight. Detectives do not rely on a single thread. They build, they layer, they take every available piece of evidence, and they look for the places where the pieces interlock, where a witness account matches a camera timestamp, where a camera timestamp matches a phone location, where a phone location matches physical trace evidence. In the case of Steven Sanchez, investigators had several key pillars to work with. The first was the testimony of the pregnant woman who had called 911. She had been at the property. She had seen Isaiah come inside with the gun already in his hand. She had heard his words. She had watched him move toward the back of the property, toward the shed where Steven was. She had heard what followed, and she had called for help immediately. Her account was consistent. It was detailed, and it placed Isaiah directly at the scene with a weapon at the exact moment Steven Sanchez was killed. The second pillar was physical evidence from the scene itself. Inside the shed, investigators found Steven's body. The forensic examination of the wound confirmed the direction and approximate range of the shot. Ballistic evidence, shell casings, bullet trajectory was consistent with the account provided by the witness. Trace evidence from the scene helped paint a picture of exactly what had happened and in what sequence. The third pillar was surveillance footage. The neighborhood had cameras. Businesses, residences, traffic intersections, all of them record all the time in most American neighborhoods. Investigators pulled footage from the hours around the shooting and in the days that followed. They tracked the movement of vehicles. They tracked figures. They found what they were looking for. Isaiah's movements could be placed. His presence in the area was confirmed. His flight from the scene was documented, not completely, not in one clean, continuous recording, but in fragments that placed together told a coherent story. The fourth element was the gun. Law enforcement investigators worked to trace the weapon used in the shooting. Who owned it? How Isaiah had come to have it? Whether it could be forensically connected to the bullet recovered from the scene. Firearms forensics is meticulous work. It takes time, but the results when they come are often definitive. What investigators were building was a case that did not depend on Isaiah Rhea's confession. They were building on a case that could survive his denial. And they were building it carefully because they knew that when this went to trial, the defense would have something to work with. A man with a documented history of delusional thinking. A man who believed in shapeshifters. A man who by many accounts was not operating in the same perceptual universe as everyone else at the time of the shooting. The prosecution would need the evidence to be airtight. Then came the chase. On the third day after the shooting, Isaiah Rhea was found behind the wheel of a brown SUV. Officers who had been actively searching for him in connection with the murder of Steven Sanchez spotted the vehicle. What followed was not a quiet end to a 3-day search. Isaiah did not pull over. He accelerated. In a residential area where the posted speed limit was approximately 30 miles per hour, Isaiah Rhea pushed that SUV past 80. He was moving through streets designed for families coming home from work and children walking to school, and he was driving as though none of that existed. The pursuit stretched through the area as police units worked to contain and slow the fleeing vehicle. Radio communication was constant. Officers tracked his movements. Spike strips were potentially deployed. Tactical decisions were made at high speed about how to end this without additional casualties. Then came the PIT maneuver. PIT stands for Pursuit Intervention Technique. It is a controlled method by which a pursuing police vehicle makes targeted contact with the rear quarter panel of a fleeing vehicle in order to cause it to spin out and lose forward momentum. When executed correctly, the fleeing vehicle comes to a controlled stop rather than a catastrophic crash. It is not without risk. Officers trained in PIT execute it with precision. The maneuver connected. The brown SUV spun. It lost control. It came to a stop. Isaiah Joseph Rhea was taken into custody. He was not armed with the original firearm at the time of the chase, or at least it was not produced in a way that threatened officers. He was placed in handcuffs on the side of a road somewhere in the city 3 days after Steven Sanchez had died in a shed in someone's backyard. The running was over. Now the reckoning would begin. The case went to trial. Isaiah Joseph Rhea sat in a courtroom and listened as the evidence against him was laid out in detail. The prosecution presented the testimony of the key witness. They presented the physical and forensic evidence from the shed. They presented the surveillance footage. They presented the ballistic findings. They presented the timeline of the shooting, the flight, and the arrest. The defense, as expected, addressed the question of Isaiah's mental state. When a defendant's capacity to understand the nature of their actions is genuinely in question, the law has specific frameworks for evaluating that. Whether Isaiah met the legal threshold for diminished capacity or any formal affirmative defense based on mental health is a question that the jury was asked to weigh alongside all other evidence. The jury deliberated, and they returned a verdict. Isaiah Joseph Rhea was found guilty. The jury convicted him on 2 counts. The first count, murder in the second degree. Second-degree murder in most American jurisdictions refers to an intentional killing that was not premeditated with prior planning a killing that occurred in the heat of the moment or through conduct demonstrating a depraved indifference to human life. The jury found that Isaiah had intentionally fired the weapon that killed Steven Sanchez, and that this killing, whatever its context, met the legal definition of second-degree murder. The second count, unlawful possession of a firearm. This count addressed Isaiah's possession of the weapon itself, carrying a firearm, in a manner or capacity that was not legally permitted. The details of why his specific possession was classified as unlawful were addressed during proceedings, but the outcome was clear. 2 guilty verdicts. At sentencing, the judge reviewed the facts of the case, the circumstances of the crime, Isaiah's background, and the impact on the victim's family. The sentence came down. 20 years in state prison. 20 years. Steven Sanchez was 34 years old. Isaiah Rhea will not breathe free air again until he is in his mid-40s at the earliest, assuming no early release, no parole, and that is a significant assumption. For the family of Steven Sanchez, no sentence could restore what they lost. But the system had delivered its answer. Isaiah Rhea would be removed from the world that Steven had lived in, and the case was closed. Now we need to go deeper, because the facts of this case, a shooting, a flight, an arrest, a conviction, only tell part of the story. The more disturbing and more important part of the story lives in what Isaiah Rhea said in that interrogation room, and in what the people who knew him had been observing in the months before the shooting. Isaiah believed in shapeshifters. That is not a figure of speech. It is not a metaphor he was using to describe people who were two-faced or deceptive. He appeared to genuinely believe that certain individuals around him were capable of physically changing their form, that they were not entirely human, or that their human appearance was a kind of mask that could be dropped. This specific type of belief, the delusion that people in one's environment are not who or what they appear to be, has a clinical name. It falls under a category sometimes called delusions of misidentification. There are several recognized variants. One of the most documented is Capgras syndrome, in which a person believes that a loved one has been replaced by an identical imposter. Another is Fragoli syndrome, in which a person believes that multiple different people are actually the same person in disguise. What Isaiah described sounds like a more expansive version of this kind of delusional framework. Not just one person replaced, but a broader belief that the world contained hidden entities wearing human skin. These kinds of beliefs are typically associated with serious psychotic disorders, most commonly schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or psychosis triggered by substances or extreme stress. They are not rare. They are also not well understood by the general public. When investigators reviewed Isaiah's behavior in the interrogation room, they were not simply looking for guilt or innocence. They were also, whether they articulated it this way or not, constructing a psychological portrait. They were asking, how does this person think? What does this person believe? What was his internal experience of the night he allegedly shot Stephen Sanchez? The phrase he used, "I thought you wanted me to do that," is one of the most psychologically loaded lines in this entire case. It suggests a command hallucination or command delusion. The belief that an external source, in this case the pregnant woman, had communicated to him that a specific action should be taken, that this action was sanctioned. People who experience command hallucinations describe hearing voices that instruct them to act in specific ways. People who experience command delusions describe receiving signals or communications through behavior, through looks, through what feels like unspoken consensus that a certain action is required of them. Isaiah may have believed with complete sincerity that the pregnant woman had in some way asked him to do what he did, that she had communicated to him that Stephen needed to die, that he was fulfilling a purpose rather than committing a crime. This does not mean he was not responsible in a legal sense. The jury decided that it did not. But it does mean that the calculus of what happened that night is far more complex than a simple story of rage or robbery or revenge. It means that Isaiah Rhea may have been in the grip of a mental illness that had gone unaddressed or inadequately addressed for a long time before he walked into that backyard with a gun. And it forces us to ask a question that no sentence can fully answer. What would have happened if someone had intervened earlier? That question will stay with anyone who looks closely at this case. We need to stop here, because in cases like this, it is easy for the victim to become background, to become the event that sets the story in motion, to become defined entirely by how they died rather than by how they lived. Stephen Sanchez was not a statistic. He was not a prop in someone else's tragedy. He was 34 years old, and he had a whole life that had nothing to do with the night he died. He had people who loved him, people who knew his voice and his habits and his sense of humor and the particular way he moved through a room. He had history, he had inside jokes, he had mornings where he woke up thinking about something completely ordinary, food or a friend or a show he wanted to watch with no idea that time was running out. 34 is young. People who die at 34 have not yet hit the midpoint of the life they plan to live. They have not yet seen everything they wanted to see. They have not had the conversations they kept putting off, or taken the trips they kept saying they would take, or made peace with the things that needed peace made with them. Stephen left people behind, people who will carry the shape of his absence for the rest of their lives. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from violent loss, from having someone you love taken not by illness, not by accident, but by another person's deliberate action. Grief researchers describe it as a grief that often comes wrapped in anger and shock, in a way that natural loss does not. There is no preparation. There is no slow goodbye. There is a person, and then there is a phone call, and then there is nothing. The family of Stephen Sanchez received that phone call in the early morning hours of April 29, 2024. Their lives divided into before and after at that moment. The courtroom proceedings, the testimony, the evidence, the verdict, the sentence, those things exist in the after. They are the world's attempt to respond to what was done, to name it and to impose a consequence. But consequences are not comfort. They are not Stephen. Nothing will ever be Stephen. He should have been there for birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings that nobody remembers but everyone needs. He should have been there for the small accumulation of a life lived among the people who cared about him. He was not. And that is the truest thing about this case. Everything else, the investigation, the flight, the chase, the trial, all of it exists because Stephen Sanchez died. He deserved better. He deserved to come home. This case is not isolated. That is one of the hardest things to absorb about it. The elements that came together on the morning of April 29, 2024, a man in mental health crisis, a firearm, a social environment that had normalized warning signs, a lack of intervention before the breaking point. These elements come together in towns and cities across this country every single week. The United States has one of the most significant intersections of untreated mental illness and firearm access in the world. Studies on homicide cases involving psychotic perpetrators consistently find that a substantial portion involved individuals who had shown clear signs of deteriorating mental health before the violent event. Signs that were seen, signs that were noted, in some cases documented, but that did not result in the kind of intervention that might have prevented what followed. Isaiah's belief in shapeshifters was not a secret. The people around him knew. The witness who called 911 knew. The people in his social circle knew. Whether anyone reported it formally to mental health services or law enforcement is unknown. Whether those services, if contacted, could have done anything meaningful is also unknown. Mental health intervention in the United States is a patchwork system that often responds only when a crisis has already occurred, not before. This is a structural failure. It is not a failure of any individual. It is not a failure of the investigators who did their jobs thoroughly and professionally. It is not a failure of the witness who called 911 at great personal risk while carrying a child. It is a failure of systems that are supposed to catch people before they fall through the floor and consistently do not. There is also the matter of the gun. Isaiah Rhea was in an obvious state of psychiatric crisis in the period leading up to the shooting, and yet he had access to a firearm. He walked into that property with a loaded weapon already in his hand. How? That question belongs to a larger national conversation that this country has been struggling to have for decades. Background checks, red flag laws, waiting periods, mental health, reporting requirements. All of these are tools that exist in various forms, in various states, with varying effectiveness. None of them are perfect. None of them catch every case. But the conversation is worth having because Steven Sanchez is dead. And the variable that made his death possible beyond the fractured mind of the man who shot him was access to a weapon. The third lesson this case offers is about community awareness. When someone in your circle begins expressing beliefs that are fundamentally disconnected from reality, not just unusual beliefs, not just eccentric opinions, but sustained, expanding convictions about the hidden nature of the world and the people in it, that is a signal. It is not a signal to be afraid of that person. It is not a signal to cut them off. It is a signal to take seriously, to report to professionals, to push for evaluation. Not because people with mental illness are inherently dangerous. The data actually shows that people experiencing psychosis are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. But because a person in a serious psychotic break is suffering, deeply, privately, often invisibly, and because in rare cases, rare but real, that suffering can find an outward expression that destroys lives. Isaiah Rhea needed help before April 2024. He did not get the kind of help that could have changed what happened. Steven Sanchez paid the price for that. We began with a backyard, a shed, a spring night, a 34-year-old man who did not know what was coming. We followed the story through 3 days of flight, through a chase that hit 80 miles per hour on residential streets, through an interrogation room where truth and delusion sat across the table from each other, through a courtroom where 12 ordinary citizens weighed the evidence and delivered their verdict. 20 years. That is what Isaiah Joseph Rhea will give to a prison cell for what happened to Steven Sanchez. It does not feel like enough if you are part of Steven's family. It may feel like too much if you see Isaiah as someone who needed a hospital long before he needed a cell. Both of those things can be true at the same time. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths about cases that sit at the intersection of violence and mental illness. They do not resolve cleanly. They do not offer the catharsis of a clearly evil villain defeated. They offer something messier and harder to hold: a tragedy that had multiple points of failure, a victim who deserved protection and did not receive it, a perpetrator whose mind was broken in ways that neither excuse nor erase what he did. The question this case leaves behind is this: at what point had Isaiah Rhea already been failed by the people around him, by the systems that might have caught him, by a culture that does not know how to see mental illness until it becomes a headline? We do not have a clean answer. What we have is Steven Sanchez, a man who worked beside people who cared about him, a man who had 34 years of mornings and evenings and the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a human life, a man who was in a shed on a spring night and never walked out. If you are watching this and you are someone who recognizes the warning signs we talked about in someone, the expanding delusions, the fracturing from shared reality, The beliefs that grow larger and stranger and more certain over time, please reach out to a mental health crisis line. Please speak to a professional. Please take it seriously before a night like April 29th becomes the night that everything changes. And if you are watching this and you simply needed to know Stephen's name, now you do. His name was Stephen Sanchez. He was 34 years old. He mattered. He still does.